Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name's Nick Rijke. I work for MSIF, and I'm going to take you through our application to the World Health Organization's Essential Medicine List. I'll try to introduce MSIF to you, tell you a little about MS as a disease, and then the main part of the presentation will be on the work we did to review all of the various medications used to treat MS and settle on the ones that we have included in the application. Briefly on my own conflicts, I have none other than the fact that I do work for MSIF. At the start of the project, I was Deputy CEO. I'm now a consultant. So MSIF as an organisation, it's an umbrella body really for patient organisations around the world. There's 47 organisations that are full members, plus many more that MSIF works with. And in addition to the patient organisations, MSIF facilitates collaboration among clinical groups and scientific groups around the world and involves a wide range of clinical scientists in its work. Its work is really broad, but it's had as a core part of its strategy for a number of years improving access to healthcare and treatment. MS as a disease, I won't go into too much detail, but global prevalence now approximately 2.8 million. That was assessed in 2020. Previous assessment in 2013 estimated 2.3 million. So there is rising prevalence. The reasons for that aren't entirely clear, but at least that includes improved diagnosis, particularly earlier diagnosis. People with MS living longer with MS, largely due to the effects of treatment. And it's also true that there's improved data collection in many countries. For a number of years, MS has been categorized into different types, really relapsing MS and progressive MS. Relapsing MS is where you see waves of inflammatory attack and associated damage in the central nervous system, and people can get a little better between those relapses, so it's not in one direction, but over time, people with relapsing MS would still typically accumulate disability. Progressive forms of MS, that's where, or at least characterized by an accumulation of disability independent of those relapses or attacks of inflammatory activity. I think in recent years, it's worth saying that we now have a much better understanding of the underlying disease mechanisms in MS, multiple mechanisms of inflammation plus multiple mechanisms of neurodegeneration. And these are present in both relapsing forms of MS and progressive MS to varying degrees. So it's also important to understand clinical versus subclinical disease. For a long time, I think it's fair to say we focused on what was clinically apparent. And so clinically apparent relapses, for example, but now there's a greater focus on subclinical disease, including what we would now categorize as subclinical relapses. And so MRI has been important for a number of years. It's increasingly important, both in research, but also in the clinical management of MS, not just in diagnosis, but also for monitoring the course of disease and whether treatment is adequately suppressing the disease or not. And over time, there will be other markers of disease that become increasingly important. But certainly for now, MRI is very important. How MS affects people, well, the truth is it's very different from person to person, and even within a person, it can be very different over time. That's the nature of relapsing remitting disease. But this excellent study was done by Rivka Green, which showed the health state consequences of different symptoms that people experience. And she highlighted fatigue, spasticity, and pain, but the truth is that many of these symptoms have a great bearing on people's health state. It's an incredibly difficult disease to live with, not just because of the range of symptoms people might experience, but because of that unpredictability. Now, it's also fair to say that some of these symptoms are not well measured in trials for disease-modifying therapy. Those heavily weighted towards walking, and so that's where some of the other measures that trials might include, such as MRI, such as quality of life, become more important because they hopefully can capture the undercurrent of disease through MRI, and quality of life measures hopefully can capture the interaction of various symptoms that people experience that have a real bearing on their lives, in addition to EDSS as a measure of disability that, as I say, is very focused on walking. So what do people with MS want from their treatment? This is a really brief summary, really, but it's at a simple level, it's reducing or stopping relapses, slowing or hopefully stopping that accumulation of disability. People really don't want the serious unwanted side effects. And those three tend to be quite well captured in clinical trials. Less well captured is that people want treatments that are easy to live with on a day-to-day basis. They want good news when they have their scans and tests, and ultimately they want to live their best lives. It's interesting that when you ask people more open questions about what they want, people will often talk not just in terms of the aversion of various symptoms and things that are obvious in that sense, but they'll talk about more social determinants of health. So things around relationships, the ability to stay in work is really important to people. So it's a complex disease, affects people in complicated ways, and the measurement of it can therefore also be quite complicated. But fundamentally, we know that treatment of MS can now make a substantial difference to people's quality of life, particularly over the long term. The real problem that we face is that although scientifically we've had tremendous success going from no treatments in the 1990s to one or two, and now with a wide range of therapies that work quite differently and have quite different levels of efficacy and indeed safety too. So we really want people to have full access to the wide range of DMTs all over the world. The truth is that we're quite a long way from that. Access is not equal even in the higher income countries, but there's a particular problem between low income countries, lower middle, and then the higher income countries, where access in the lower income settings is often very poor. And that's even worse when we focus on the higher efficacy treatments. This study focused on alemtuzumab, natalizumab, and ocrelizumab, where there was no, officially anyway, no availability in low-income countries, little availability in the lower middle income, and even patchy availability in some other countries too. So that's the problem we're trying to address, is to have more equitable availability of medication, particularly high efficacy medication across the world. We don't see the essential medicines list as a panacea to that problem. It's more that we see, and have seen for a while, that it could play a really big part in a number of different solutions. Some obvious examples are that it can be a prompt to a variety of different access schemes, from voluntary licensing to the kind of schemes that companies themselves will come up with to make medicines more accessible, a whole range of different initiatives on a national level that can work well. And there can also be a more direct effect, as a number of countries at the very least reflect on the WHO essential medicine list, and there are a few that will mirror it directly. So we applied in 2018. In the 2019, our application was rejected. The need was recognized, and we were encouraged by the WHO to reapply. In doing that, the WHO wanted us to review all commonly used medication for MS. Previously, we'd focused mostly on the licensed therapies. And they wanted us to, in particular, include in our review azathioprine and rituximab as the two most commonly used off-label medicines, in addition to all commonly used medication. So we established two working groups, international working groups. The first to specifically look at rituximab and azathioprine, still focusing on low resource settings. And the second was the much wider review, starting with 30 medicines under review for the essential medicines list decision making, and that was our MEMP panel. We did them sequentially, so MOLT, looking at the off-label treatments, worked first, and MEMP then followed that up. The results of both of these, as I'll describe later, were then brought together to try to make the, with other evidence too, which I'll describe, to try to make the final decision. The big difference between these two working groups was the body of evidence that they looked at. For the off-label reviews for MOLT, we looked at non-randomized controlled studies as well as RCTs, whereas for MEMP, doing a large network meta-analysis of 30 treatments, that wasn't really feasible, so we focused on RCTs only. Right at the outset, we the second time around, in a sense, we wanted to do absolutely everything at the highest possible level of quality. And so we engaged the Cochrane Library and the WHO Collaborating Centre in Bologna to do the evidence reviews, to assemble all the evidence for us. And we engaged the GRADE Centre at McMaster University to supervise, in a sense, the methodology for both of those guideline panels. So we had a clinical chair for each panel, but we also had a chair from the GRADE Centre to make sure that we followed all of the right processes through the whole program of work. The panels were multidisciplinary, which you'd expect from that process. We made sure that we involved expertise across the MS field, but also people from outside of MS as well. We thought that was important, people like healthcare economists, but others too. We've sought feedback from the WHO on and off through the process. We have worked with the medicines patent pool a little bit. They, for example, did the patent landscape work for us. And you'll see later that we, towards the end of our process, we consulted across the clinical community too. Now, for those of you who've been through an evidence to decision process, this slide will hopefully make sense. Ultimately, it starts with being really clear about what your outcomes are, what are the PICO questions you want to answer, defining how you're going to measure outcomes, as well as being clear about what the outcomes themselves are, and then applying all the rigor you'd expect from systematic reviews from really high quality centre in Bologna and the Cochrane Library to do that work, and using them as well to do just as much a high quality review of the evidence for all of the other ETD criteria. So things like cost effectiveness, equity, resources required, all of those sorts of things were all as evidence-based as could possibly be. So why the ETD criteria? Ultimately, they map really well to the EML criteria. So that's the main reason to use it, but also the rigor and the process involved really helps in terms of impartiality. It helps to consider everything appropriately. And although you could say it's quite process heavy, we really valued that for the rigorous steer it gave us through the program. The outcomes were judged separately by the MOLT panel and the MEMP panel. You'll see that they came out very similarly, and they were based on us having agreed detailed descriptors of each outcome before deciding which ones we thought were the most important. And that was done from the perspective and with the involvement of both patients and clinicians. The off-label panel, MOLT, chose a number of critical and important outcomes. You could see that this is quite a few, but I hope that given the complexity I described, you'll see why these are all seen as being either critical or important, trying to capture things which are clinical as well as subclinical. And then a similar list was agreed by MEMP. The difference with the MEMP approach was that we also agreed health state utility values for the outcomes. Some of those were evidence-based from previous systematic review, and others we then had to judge as a panel using those that were evidence-based as our anchor points. So in the end, we had health state utility values for all of the outcomes that we were using for the MEMP review. And of course, when you've agreed those outcomes, that's really important for driving the systematic reviews that follow. So in this case, the network meta-analysis was based on this pattern of outcomes. When the analysis was completed and the panel was able to see not just summary of findings tables, but also for the MEMP review, this distillation of how the treatments can affect outcomes turned into health state utility values, we were able to construct a table like this. This one is for relapsing MS, ranking the treatments according to the net balance between both desirable and undesirable effects. Now, the table does need a bit of caution in interpretation. The panel was able to see beneath this to look at the full detail of how each treatment affected each outcome, and importantly could then see where treatment outcomes were not reflected in the data that we were looking at. Which could be because it simply wasn't measured in the trial, or it could be that the trial used a measure of an outcome that we were not extracting because it wasn't an outcome measure that we'd chosen, which of course we did at the outset. So care is needed in using the table, but it was incredibly useful to be able to judge not just the magnitude of effect through the systematic reviews, but then the importance of the magnitude of effect through the health state utility system. We then went through the full ETD process. We did that for MOLT first and then for MEMP. This again is a table for relapsing MS, where you end up with the range of treatments that had been shortlisted based on the balance of effects and how they performed in each of the criteria. It can have a slightly flattening effect because you only have so many different ratings to give things. So for example, under acceptability, we had quite a number of treatments rated as probably yes for acceptability. But beneath that, the panel had seen the evidence and discussed the fact that people with MS have a strong preference for either oral or infrequent infusion therapy. So there was a preference for those over the treatment by regular injection. So there were subtleties beneath these ratings that aren't immediately apparent in the table, but will have been discussed by the panel in some detail. So based on the full ETD process, for MOLT and for MEMP, both panels agreed recommendations, which I'll try to take you through. So we'd started with that long list of 30 medicines, had a short list based on balance of effects, and then done the network meta-analysis under MEMP with a smaller piece of work focused on 2 treatments for MOLT. That was obviously the very large list we started with. We also, and I'll come back to this, but in addition to forming the recommendations from the panels, we did also do further work on special populations, which I'll explain later, square box groupings, and then had a final shortlisting process where we chose the 3 medications in the application. In terms of the recommendations, those in the green box are the ones that had unequivocal favourable for recommendations for both relapsing and progressive MS. This is from the MEMP panel. There was also treatments that were rated as for or against, dependent on setting. And it's really important to stress that we, in the case, for example, of natalizumab and alemtuzumab for relapsing MS, the panel absolutely recognized that these are high efficacy therapies that can be used to great effect, but it's very much then dependent on setting. And we were focusing on low resource settings where it was felt there are particular challenges that make those medicines less suitable. The screening to some extent, but particularly the monitoring. In the case of natalizumab, that becomes more important over time. and also for natalizumab, there's a potential issue around reliability of medicine supply, that people who stop natalizumab can have an upsurge of disease, rebound activity, which of course we don't want. So in settings where the supply of medicine is uncertain, natalizumab is a less easy treatment to use. And for alemtuzumab also has intense monitoring requirements, and those requirements persist for a number of years after therapy has been stopped. And there was some doubt that that would make the medicine suitable for low resource settings. You might notice also under progressive MS, we had 4 with applicable remark. That's for azathioprine and methotrexate. This was where we felt that those treatments should be used on condition that other treatments are simply not accessible. And that was because of the low evidence base available for those medications. The evidence base that was there was favourable, but the trials that produced that evidence were really very small, and we didn't feel that we could give them unequivocal 4 recommendations. But all of the treatments in the green boxes here for relapsing and progressive MS were taken through to the next stage. The others weren't. Similar process for the MOLT panel, that rituximab for relapsing and progressive MS got positive 4 recommendations. Azathioprine again had the applicable remark for relapsing MS about being used where other medication was not available or not accessible. And that panel felt that there was insufficient evidence to even make a recommendation on azathioprine for progressive MS. The special populations, given the demographics of MS, where MS is roughly 2.5 times more common among women and is common among relatively young women, we felt that pregnancy was an important special population, breastfeeding associated with that. And we also looked at pediatric MS, or pediatric use of the medications. We were never intending to apply for the children's list and haven't, but the WHO really wanted us to at least comment on the suitability of any of the medications we were applying for pediatric use. So that's why that's a special population considered too. As previously, we based the evidence trawl on systematic reviews. We supplemented that with things like regulatory status and additional expert opinion to flesh out the amount of evidence that we had in front of us as a panel. The picture was quite complicated. If I focus on the 3 treatments that we have applied for, glatiramer acetate, it came out as the safest treatment for pregnancy, also safe for breastfeeding, and at least has a license extension for pediatric use and is commonly used in pediatric MS. Rituximab and or ocrelizumab can also be used in pregnancy. It's the infrequent mode of administration every 6 months can make it suitable, particularly for planned pregnancy. So it has at least a partial tick for pregnancy, less so for breastfeeding for the anti-CD20 treatments, where it's generally considered safer to avoid. But rituximab and ocrelizumab are, even though they don't yet have license extensions, they are widely used in the treatment of pediatric MS. And then cladribine, we didn't see as being suitable for any of the special populations. We looked at square box groupings and looked at a number of different ways of doing it. In the end, we settled on mechanism of action. A number of the treatments that ended up in our final stage of consideration that you'll see benefit in a sense from having square box alternatives. We felt the square box was really important in being able to give more flexibility in healthcare settings. So if you recommend a treatment and can identify therapeutic alternatives, there's a greater chance of the treatment being present in the healthcare system and accessible within the healthcare system. And just as a follow-on from that, in the end, we did recommend rituximab as a therapy and recommended ocrelizumab as a suitable therapeutic alternative. And so in those countries where an off-label therapy, rituximab, is more difficult to access, as sometimes they can be if they're off-label, then ocrelizumab represents a very good alternative to that. We didn't in the end include ofatumumab simply because it wasn't one of the medicines we'd assessed in detail when we did the shortlisting exercise. Of course, it could be added in future, as could other anti-CD20 medications as they become available. So the final round of decision-making, taking the most positive recommendations from the guidelines, it was a complex final discussion, really. It was clear in a sense that we'd had, our guidelines had ranked treatments. And so cladribine and rituximab had emerged as the highest ranked treatments in the guidelines the guideline processes that we'd completed. But we still needed to go through plenty of deliberation to make sure we were choosing the right treatment, and we needed to reflect back on the special populations. But in the end, rituximab with ocrelizumab in square box was felt to have high efficacy. The long dosing interval has advantages both for the healthcare system and for the people with MS. It's already listed, rituximab in this case is already listed on the WHO for other indications, and both are commonly used in pediatric MS. Now, it's also fair to say that rituximab is available at a significantly lower cost than most other DMTs for MS, and that's quite a significant advantage too, and partly gave it higher ratings when you look at things like resources required and cost effectiveness, health equity. We weren't led by cost, but we gave it appropriate consideration through the process. Cladribine, well, it has also a relatively short treatment period, 2 rounds of treatment over 2 years, and then at least that is the treatment. Some people will go on to have further rounds of treatment, but the treatment as approved is those 2 rounds of treatment. It has low risk of rebound if treatment is stopped. It's efficacious, and it's available as an oral therapy too. And as I mentioned earlier, that's a popular choice with people with MS. And that kind of livability issue, being able to choose an oral therapy or an infrequent infusion, does become important when you consider things like adherence. Asking people to take drugs on a regular basis that they find difficult to take isn't a great idea. So for us, the oral administration was an important factor too. And then glatiramer acetate really was incorporated primarily because of its performance on safety in pregnancy, breastfeeding, and its pediatric use too. It does have low monitoring, it's widely available, but as I say, its inclusion was really around the value that it has for those special populations. And as I've explained, with the demographics of MS, having an option that people would readily be able to go for without complication during pregnancy is important. I should say that this final round of decision included some quite tight decisions. It would have been perfectly easy for us in many ways to just say that all 6 of the final treatments should have been applied for. But we always felt that it was important to go with an application that was as short as it could reasonably be while still providing something of the range of MS treatments. And so in the end, we have a treatment by a regular infusion, which is highly efficacious, an oral treatment, and one of the old platform injectables too. For cladribine, the tough decision was against fingolimod and dimethyl fumarate. Fingolimod had a disadvantage that it's one of the drugs that people, if they have to stop taking it, for example, the medicine supply is uncertain, then disease rebound can be a significant problem. So that counted against it. Dimethyl fumarate, we saw in the evidence, due to gastric problems, had quite a high level of discontinuation for people who were taking it. So although they are good drugs, appropriate in many settings and for many people, we felt that looking at low-income settings, trying to agree as few a list of treatments as possible, that we should go with cladribine. And then against glatiramer acetate, the tight decision was glatiramer versus interferon. But glatiramer acetate had an interferon like glatiramer acetate would have been there for its safety in pregnancy, breastfeeding, and pediatric MS. Glatiramer in the end was chosen because it had a higher safety rating in pregnancy, with one of the high quality regulators giving it a formal higher safety rating. So that's why it was chosen. We then, after we'd made the choice of the three treatments, we consulted the clinical community and also the patient organizations. So this is a list of the endorsing clinical organizations. We were very pleased with the range of organizations that wanted to endorse the application. We haven't listed the patient organizations separately because in a sense they come as part of MSIF as an organization, but we did go through a thorough process of making sure that they were on board, and they effectively collectively made the final decision on submitting the application to you. So all that remains is for me to say thank you. It's been quite a presentation. Of course, we will be very happy to answer any further questions that people have at any stage of the process.